All right, guys, welcome back to your Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here will be looking at Auburn football and the expectations for Hugh Freeze in his second year with the Tigers. Kind of just putting a stamp on 2023, his debut season, 6-7 campaign. This was the image of a hot and cold team. They started 3-0, lost 4-0 once they entered conference play, ripped off 3 wins in a row, lost 3 to end the season. Hot and cold as it gets. And this sequence right here kind of really summarizes that sentiment. They lost at home to New Mexico State, where they were held to 65 rushing yards, but they ran for 200-plus on Georgia and Alabama, 5 yards per carry or more in both of those games, 2 rushing touchdowns each in those games. And Nick, and I know you always tell me this, especially when Bama comes to town, and it's the Tigers play top-ranked teams better than anyone else when they're at Jordan-Hare. This, quite frankly, makes zero sense one bit. With that said, should we be concerned? Or is Hugh Freeze just, the latest to kind of embrace the good riddance of Auburn playing so good at home when it matters most?
It really needs to be studied how Auburn performed so well at Jordan-Hare against top teams, right? They hung in with Georgia. They should have beat Alabama, took up, a Hail Mary to do it. And if you look back at the past Iron Bowls, they beat Alabama in 17, they beat Alabama in 19. Brian Harsin, who was, looked down as the worst coach in Auburn history, took them to 4 overtimes and should have won that game as well. Auburn doesn't get the job done, but they hang in certainly the miracle or the prayer at Jordan-Hare, the kick six, all that stuff, right? So there's some sort of magic there. When you take those 2 games against Georgia and Alabama, I know they're losses, but you isolate the statistics from it, you got to be pretty happy if you're an Auburn fan. But when you look at the New Mexico State game, the Maryland game, the game against LSU, the game against Ole Miss, which was also at home, you look at it and you're like, wow, what are we doing here? This is a team that, I'm concerned about, right? The stats against Alabama, the stats against Georgia were impressive, right? Hugh Freeze is a great recruiter, so there is no doubt that he's going to come in there and put together what is an incredibly talented team over time. He has a great class coming in. In this cycle, he's put together a really solid coaching staff, in my opinion, right? He plugged in DJ Durkin at defensive coordinator, who obviously has some off-the-field issues in the past at Maryland, but there's no doubt he can coach a defense. We saw it at Ole Miss and Texas A&M in his last stops. Derek Nix is the offensive coordinator. I think that's an interesting gamble there. I think he's got some seriously nice potential there. They rotated some other pieces in there. Charles Kelly comes in as co-defensive coordinator with Durkin. He's a guy that has experience at Alabama, a guy that was at Colorado as well, another veteran. They lose Cadillac Williams for some off-the-field issues as well, but now this staff is sort of Freeze's staff. Pretty much everyone on the staff at this point, Freeze hired himself, so it is sort of him building the staff. He's going to hit the recruiting trail hard. If you're an Auburn fan, yes, the blowing hot and cold has to concern you, because when you beat Arkansas 48-10, I know Arkansas aren't great, you're probably really excited. Then you come back the next week and you lose to New Mexico State at home by 21. You got to be like scratching your head trying to figure out what the hell's going on. This team is very odd. They're going to continue to be very odd, but if anyone's going to right the ship, Hugh Freeze looks like the guy to do it.
You lose by 21 to New Mexico State, but play Alabama, Ole Miss, Georgia, all teams that were in the CFP, but you lose to them by 7 points or less. I just don't know what's going on. That's the strangest thing I've ever seen. But I definitely think that's certainly positive, right? You can play all those guys very good. Obviously, all those games, again, we're at home. You want to see how they can compete on the road. But I think it's certainly important to note that you're not just getting battered out of the way by these elite opponents. You can certainly showcase some physicality against, this highly explosive offenses. Speaking of the Auburn offense, we're going to kind of look at what's to look forward to for them. And it was a pretty poor unit, right? This is the 7th straight season with the new offensive coordinator. You alluded to Derek Nix, Ole Miss wide receiver coach. He arrives here for Auburn. This rushing attack had new issues, with the Bulldogs and the Tide. They put up 189 rushing yards per game. Jarquez Hunter, a massive return, a player I assumed would probably enter the transfer portal by now. Alston overall, the top 3 rushers are back. Alston, he was the backup running back for them. He was pretty impressive. Damari Alston, that is, 320 yards, 5 yards per carry. Peyton Thorne, he ended up showcasing some nice rushing abilities. I didn't think he had in him, right? But this rushing attack, 189 yards per game, was pretty impressive for them. But it wasn't enough to outlast how poor that quarterback play really was. 124th in FBS in passing yards per game. Again, I thought Thorne really played hard for this team at times. I had no idea how impressive runner he could be. I think it was against Georgia. He ripped off a big run. I was like, man, I had no idea how fast he was. This is a guy who's proven in the past he could throw the football. A couple years back with Mel Tucker and that Michigan State team that made the New York Six, made a real push for the Big Ten that year. He showed he could throw the football, right? But this is a guy who had 5 games of less than 100 passing yards. He went 5 of 16 versus Alabama. we acknowledged how poor this wide receiver group was and ended up taking a larger scale than expected in terms of toll on this group, in terms of negativity, right? Because the running game, they were pretty admirable, right? And I think they're even a little bit better than we expected. But the passing attack, Nick, it still was incredibly poor. And that's a big reason why they were unable to really show up against these tougher opponents, where they had less than 100 against Bama and Georgia, and they still almost beat them due to the physicality of this rushing attack. I certainly think that's very encouraging, right? Because if you can get some better quarterback play with a revamped wide receiver room we're about to talk about, Auburn could really have a nice offense on their hands.
For me, Peyton Thorne has to be one of the most disappointing transfers of this past season. When he came in, a lot of people were really excited. Some Auburn fans were saying he was a better quarterback than Jalen Milroe, was going to have a better season than Milroe did. Obviously, that's not how it ended up shaking out, and those Auburn fans, probably were just speaking on their own bias. You look at him, right? That sophomore season you talked about in 21 at Michigan State was a really solid season, right? 6% comp rate, 27 touchdowns, 10 picks. You really thought that could be a lot to work with there. 16 touchdowns to 10 interceptions this past season at Auburn, 1,700 yards passing, about around half what he got in that season at Michigan State. So that's definitely disappointing. Yes, the wide receiving room was poor. We're going to highlight that. Obviously, right, that does play a role into it. He didn't have great players to throw to, so certainly not entirely on him. And he did look good running the ball, right, at times. He really was talented on the ground. The 5.15 and 3 scores is impressive. Jacquez Hunter, Damari Alston are two really solid backs to return. Hunter is a really good dynamic back, a nice guy. Had some, off the field issues in the past as well, but now that he's sort of focused, got his head on right, I think he can be a great player. Should break that 1,000-yard mark this year. Fell 100 yards short this past season. But now you're going to transition, and they're recruiting a lot of talented wide receivers. They're going to have to continue to recruit talented wide receivers because this wide receiver room was very bare last year and struggled immensely.
Very bare indeed, but I think I'm pretty excited for what they got going on. Rivaldo Fairweather, they added him in the portal from FIU last year. Ended up leading this team in everything. 38 receptions for 394 and 6 touchdowns. Pretty good numbers from a tight end, right? But not as your leading pass catcher. That's certainly, again, a massive concern. Javaris Johnson, a big playmaker for them. Only got the ball 2 times per game last season, only 19 receptions. So, a lot more disappointing than even we expected. But this is why we're excited, right? Cam Coleman, the 5th-ranked recruit out of Phoenix City. They outlasted the Crimson Tide for this absurdly talented playmaker, already making waves early on this offseason. He's got some great speed. He can win with size, the physicality, or just pure leaping ability. He was really known as a pure vertical threat as he continues to develop. That's exactly what they're going to need him to be early on. He'll develop, his route running ability, certainly, and he'll become a more complete receiver. But that's exactly what they need, though. A burner who can win deep and make plays for them. Cam Coleman checks the boxes right away. Seems like a player that's going to lead them in targets from day one.
This is a guy that's fantastic, right? Cam Coleman was a highly ranked prospect coming out of high school. And obviously, everyone wanted him. Alabama wanted him. It was a battle in-state, a guy from downstate who was a really talented player, top to bottom, who really can do a whole lot for you. You plug him in here, he's a guy that can jump in and make that next level for this team. He's a really talented 5-star who has a lot of potential to be a next level player for this team, right? You need that sort of player. That's what they had to get. Phoenix City, Alabama, a guy that in-state they fought for. There were some other fights as well. This is interesting when you look at it. Alabama and Auburn are going to be now battling it out for in-state players. In the past, Auburn did get a lot of talented players from the Montgomery area. They were able to keep guys in that general area coming to their program. But now you look at it, this is going to be a tough battle, in my opinion, across the state because Nick Saban's gone and Kalen DeBoer is going to have to battle against Hugh Freeze pretty much every single top-ranked prospect because that's exactly what's going to happen here. There's just so many talented players in the state of Alabama that these two programs are going to be battling for, and you saw that start early with Coleman and some other players that they battled for. The 5-star talent in Alabama is certainly there, and you're going to want to win those battles if you're Auburn to try and build yourself a roster that is talented from top to bottom here. Coleman is a great start for Hugh Freeze and company. This is a guy that's a 5-star, incredible athlete, great jumping ability, great hands. Slot him at the wide receiver X, and he's going to dominate from day one.
Some of the other guys that are going to round out this receiving group, Robert Lewis, a Georgia State transfer, had 8 drops for the Panthers this past season. Here's the leading wide receiver as an outside pass catcher, though. Really fed him the ball whenever they could. Nice possession pass catcher. Had 4 games of 10-plus targets for an offense that is significantly run first. You look at another true freshman, a high-end 4-star recruit, Bryce Kane out of the Mobile area. He was listed as 153 pounds, a track star. Obviously, he's going to bring plenty of speed to the table. Sam Jackson, the California Golden Bears transfer, actually started at quarterback against Auburn last year. He had 2 interceptions, completed only 52% of his passes. He arrives here as a wide receiver, switches to that position. He played wide receiver in high school because the team's starting quarterback, Nick, get this, was Peyton Thorne. So he arrives at Auburn in the exact same scenario. He was considered one of the fastest players for the Golden Bears. Not much college experience as a wide out, but he's considered a blazer in of his own right. A lot of speed they're trying to improve here, and that certainly goes a long way in trying to improve the ability to free guys up, right? Even if these guys certainly have to prove their hands, guys like Jackson and Kane, the speed is going to be evident from day one. Interesting situation that Jackson's in, though.
It's a very interesting situation, right? It doesn't really tend to work out like that ever. Kind of funny that the guy that previously was throwing to him is now also going to be throwing to him. I think that's very interesting when you look at that. Could be really exciting for Auburn. This is a guy that has potential, and Sam Jackson is kind of a very interesting story to highlight. The rest of the room, right, you have different guys. You plug in Robert Lewis, could be a player that has untapped potential coming over there from Georgia State. He has some nice potential to develop as a star player potentially for this team. Maybe not a star player, but a guy who's really good and consistent at wide receiver for Auburn here. If they can put together a consistent wide receiver room with the two backs they have and Thorne, who's shifty with his legs, this offense could certainly improve very quickly.
Yeah, of course, they also added Perry Thompson, a 38th ranked recruit, and then Malcolm Simmons. He was 150th overall in this recruiting class. Jay Fair, second on the team in 31 receptions. And then Caleb Burton. Those guys are still in town. So this is a much more formidable group for Auburn, a lot more high-end talent. Burton was a bit of a disappointment last year. But obviously, there's a lot of stuff going on in this receiving room. Shane Hooks, he really disappointed as well. He's now gone. So obviously the quarterback play has to improve, right? But having more weapons, a more respectable group here for Auburn, I think, is going to go a long way in helping Peyton Thorne kind of get back to those Michigan State days. We'll take a deeper dive into the offensive line in the summer. They did add left tackle Perry Lewis, 6'8", 345. This offense should certainly be on a much more high trajectory, Nick. All these receivers we just alluded to, Jarquez Hunter coming back for what was a pretty sound rushing attack last year. And, obviously Derek Nix did some pretty good work with the Rebels wide receivers. I'm pretty excited, Nick. I know these guys are really young. It's not just going to be, 400 yards per game off the bat or anything like that. But I certainly think this is going to be a fun group to watch, and I think their development is going to be interesting to monitor.
I think this is certainly something you have to monitor and take a look at. This is a unit that's getting better over time. If Thorne can hit those heights that you saw at Michigan State a couple of years ago with these improved talents to throw to, this Auburn offense could be night and day. It could really be a big turnaround here on the Plains.
Looking at, what's in store for this defense, I think they've really recruited at a high level in the past two classes, especially this freshman incoming class, headlined by five-star edge Amaris Williams. DJ Durkin inherits a unit that allowed 22 points per game. They did allow 100-plus rushing in 12 of the 13 games, though. They were very tough against Georgia. But for the most part, they really didn't have the heat in the middle of the linebacker, and that was a concern we had in the preseason. But we expected the defensive line to play better than they did. They didn't exactly live up to expectations outside of Marcus Harris. Pretty disappointing, I would say. They do lose three key players in that front seven. Harris, Justin Rogers, a defensive tackle. Cam Riley, one of the linebackers, transfers out. They do retain Jason Jones, 338-pound Oregon transfer from a couple years back. He was a good rotational piece for them in the middle. Jalen McLeod as an edge rusher was just such a pleasant surprise for them. End of the year as the team's third leading tackler after a huge back half of the season. Eugene Asante, he was at North Carolina a couple years ago. They do return him. He's been around plenty of years at college football, finally got on the field. He was good, but he wasn't exactly an enforcer. He was the leading tackler for this football team. I think there's an opportunity for some of these new faces to have a chance to find the field. Dorian Mosai, a Mike Elko veteran at linebacker. He's a bit of a poor performer, but he is a veteran that comes from Duke. 135th overall recruit Joe Phillips. DJ Barber, number 5 ranked athlete DeMarcus Reddick appears in line to be a linebacker for them. I think there's a lot to sort out here in this front seven. The linebacking group, though, Nick, obviously last year playing in the SEC, not having that kind of enforcer player, not having that heat, I like to say, in the middle, certainly burned them against the run, and that's why at times they're incredibly poor. They were never, just abysmal, right? But this was certainly a unit again. They give 100-plus yards in almost every single game this season. That was not expected. They need better players in the middle of their defense.
They do need better players in the middle of the defense. Austin Keys, Eugene Asante, they have to step up and be solid players. DeMarcus Riddick is a guy that comes in as a freshman, true freshman that could really be, and potentially at that wide linebacker, a good player who is really solid out of high school. Gage Keys at defensive tackle. You plug him in out of the transfer portal. What can he do early on? Jason Jones at nose tackle. Is he going to step up, have a better year? Jalen McLeod as well as a Jack. Where do you move him around? What can he do? Jamonte Waller as well as another guy coming out of high school. You can move him around. What is he going to be able to do? This room is relying on a lot of transfers and a lot of young guys, a lot of freshmen are going to step up here and be involved early on. This defense needs to improve against the run if they want to be competitive in the SEC.
Yeah, you look at the defense. Obviously, they're not taking any deep dives really today. Just kind of glancing over what they have right now. The secondary was a group we touted a lot last year. They only allowed 260 plus passing yards twice. That being the Georgia, where Brock Bowers really tore him up late in that game, and then LSU. And of course, Jaden Daniels, the Heisman Trophy winner. They lose 4 guys. 3 of which appear to be locks to be drafted. It appears. They do lose plenty of ball production. Big time addition though in Jaron Thompson from Texas. He's been a good coverage asset for the Horns over the last couple of years. Nice add there at free safety, a veteran that's really going to help teach some of these guys. Antonio Kite, they picked him up in the portal, didn't play much for Alabama. Kayin Lee, he got on the field a good bit. He was impressive as a true freshman. He's in a slot right into one of those cornerback roles. Keontae Scott should anchor the other side. He was a real good asset versus the run. Last year, depth, we really weren't all that impressed with at the cornerback position, but, obviously they had some really good starters, kind of helped wean that off. Coming into this season, though, they don't have those starters. Nick, they lose those guys. They're going to need a lot of these players to step up. And I certainly wonder what's in store for this defense. Again, this is kind of an episode talking about expectations. Obviously, the competition is going to only get tougher. What's their assessment right now? I think at least for the first half of this season, I think the defense is likely to step back unless this defensive line can really amp things up and they can be better against the run, because they're not going to have these guys in the secondary now to be tone setters. So I certainly am kind of concerned of how they might perform early on in the season, if not the entire 2024 year. Again, a lot of great recruiting. Long term, I think they'll be just fine. But for this year, it could really be, a bit of a interesting, not so friendly season for this defense.
I share the same concerns for the secondary. I think they have some players that are potentially strong players. Keontae Scott, Kayin Lee, a guy at cornerback who I think could be solid. Larkin Robinson bringing him, and Jaron Thompson bringing them as well. So there's some new looks in this secondary. This is a unit that was pretty solid throughout the season, right? They only struggled against LSU and Georgia. Are they going to be able to, keep up that same sort of intensity? What are they going to be able to do? Wesley McGriff, he's their secondary coach, cornerbacks coach. He's been around for, it's his second season there. He has 4 seasons total. So he's a guy that knows the system. Hugh Freeze likes this guy. Can McGriff and this defensive company be able to coach under these 2 new coaches in DJ Durkin and Charles Kelly, keep up the strong safety work for the secondary unit?
And you kind of take a look at the schedule. It's probably not as tough as they've had in years past. Week 2, they host Cal. Jaden Knott, he's still there. It's going to be interesting to see the things we've been alluding to, the defensive line, the linebackers, how do they defend that run game? For the first month, it's not really all that tough. They do play a really ridiculous 4-game stretch, though. Oklahoma, Georgia, Missouri, Kentucky. After that, they get a couple of cakewalks. And then at the end of the year, they get Texas A&M and Alabama. I think this is a team that can certainly compete to upset one of those guys. We'll see how they do on the road against the Bulldogs and the Tide. Hosting Oklahoma, though, it's going to be a great opportunity and potential. They'll probably be ranked in the top 25, Nick. They should be 4-0 going into this game. They can knock off Brent Venables and showcase impressive defense in doing so. People are going to be talking about the Auburn Tigers. I think the expectation is they can certainly win 8 games this season. No predictions today, obviously. But I'm very excited for this team. I love what they're doing at the wide receiver position. I think the offense will really take that next step. Some of the young guys on defense, they're going to have a chance to impress. I think this is going to be a good year to really set the tone for what's in the future for this program.
The schedule is very odd, right? You start the season with 5 straight home games, then you have 3 straight road games in the middle, then 3 more home games, plus the last trip of the season, the Iron Bowl up to Tuscaloosa. Very odd schedule, in my opinion. Obviously, right, trips to Georgia and Alabama in the same season is brutal. I always wondered why Auburn, I don't know if they insist on it, but why it's always set up that Auburn hosts those 2 teams and then travels those 2 teams in the same year. You would think that you would want to have a split 1-1. I did talk to an Auburn fan who told me that they'd like to get one of those 2 games every year, and you raise your opportunity to do so if you're going to play them at home. So maybe that's why they insist on having 2 tough road games against 2 perennial SEC powers in Georgia and Alabama on the road. Cal out of conference is a very interesting one, right? The return game from the game last year in California that I thought was a very interesting game at Berkeley. Those teams battled late night. I enjoyed watching that one. Jaden Ott could definitely torch this defense if he gets hot very early on. At Missouri, at Kentucky, hosting Vanderbilt. Those are some win potentials there. Arkansas, that's certainly a win potential. Oklahoma, that's a very interesting one, right? You highlighted that. That's a game where you look at it, that could be a big upset potential if the Jordan Hare crowd and that magic they have really is kicking a high gear on September 28th.
Yeah, that's me for today's episode, Nick. Appreciate you joining me, talking about your rival Auburn. Just a quick, nice little casual conversation about the Tigers. It's going to be fun to take a deeper dive into this team here in a few months. I'm excited for Auburn, though. Just looking at how they're doing in recruiting. I think Hugh Freeze, obviously, he did great things with Ole Miss. And I think Auburn, having them competitive, just makes college football so much more fun, even though I know you don't like to hear that.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to hear that. And as an Alabama fan, it pains me to say this, a guy who went to Alabama. But Hugh Freeze is a fantastic head coach. He's going to recruit. He's going to bring in a lot of talent. We saw that with Perry Thompson and Cam Coleman. It's going to be a tough battle in the state of Alabama for Kalen DeBoer and company up there in Tuscaloosa. It's going to be interesting to see what Auburn can do, how they can develop down there on the plains.
Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.
There you go.